A millionaire was cruelly separated from his beloved. 20 years later, he was shocked to find her with a young man identical to him on a luxury cruise. He approached. Stephen Mitchell leaned against the balustrade of the massive cruise ship, staring out at the endless stretch of turquoise water shimmering under the midday sun. The gentle rocking of the vessel and the faint chatter of other passengers filled the background, but Stephen barely noticed. His thoughts were elsewhere. Lost in the labyrinth of his past, despite his immense wealth and a life others might envy, there was a hollowness inside him, a void that years of luxury and success could never fill. 20 years had passed, yet the memory of Rachel Foster still lingered in his mind like the scent of a familiar perfume. She was the only woman who had ever truly seen him, beyond his surname, beyond the expectations that came with being a Mitchell. But she was also the woman he had lost, not through choice, but through the calculated schemes of someone who should have protected him, his mother, Deborah. Stephen straightened, brushing the lapels of his tailored linen suit. He had hoped this cruise, a spontaneous escape from the monotony of his Manhattan routine, might offer some clarity, or at the very least, distraction. Instead, the serenity of the ocean seemed to amplify his loneliness. Dinner that evening was a formal affair. The grand dining hall sparkled with crystal chandeliers, casting a warm glow over the elegantly dressed passengers. Stephen took his seat at a private table, a single-place setting in a sea of couples and families. He wasn't particularly fond of these social gatherings, but attended out of obligation to the ship's itinerary. A waiter approached, pouring him a glass of rich red wine. As he sipped, his eyes scanned the room absent-mindedly. Then, he froze. Across the hall, seated at a table near the grand piano, was a woman. Her profile was unmistakable. Those high cheekbones, the cascade of chestnut hair, the way she tilted her head slightly when listening. It was Rachel. His heart pounded in his chest like the drumbeat of a storm, and for a moment, he thought he might be imagining it. But then she laughed softly, and he knew. Rachel Foster was here, on this ship, after 2 decades. But it wasn't just her presence that shocked him. Sitting beside her was a young man, perhaps 20 or 21, with an uncanny resemblance to a version of himself he hadn't seen in years. The sharp jawline, the slightly tousled dark hair, and even the way he carried himself. It was like looking into a mirror of his younger self. Stephen couldn't breathe. Was it possible? Could this young man be his son? He tore his gaze away, his mind racing. It couldn't be a coincidence. Rachel wouldn't be here, on this cruise, with a young man who bore such a striking resemblance to him. Unless there was more to the story than he had ever known. Memories flooded back unbidden. The last time he had seen Rachel. She had been crying, begging him to listen, but his mother's voice had been louder, her accusations sharper. Deborah had insisted Rachel was unfaithful, that she was only after his money. He had been young, naive, and too afraid to stand against his mother's formidable presence, and so he had let Rachel go, believing the lies that had been so carefully constructed. Now, sitting alone in the glow of the dining hall, Stephen felt the weight of those choices pressing down on him like a stone. If that young man was indeed his son, then Deborah's betrayal went far deeper than he had ever imagined. It wasn't just his love for Rachel that had been stolen. It was an entire life he might have shared with her and their child. The evening passed in a haze. Stephen barely touched his meal, his attention flickering constantly to Rachel's table. She seemed happy, her laughter ringing out occasionally as the young man spoke animatedly. He noticed how her hand rested briefly on the boy's arm, a maternal gesture that struck a pang of longing in Stephen's chest. When the dinner ended and Rachel rose to leave, Stephen hesitated. Approaching her felt like a monumental step, one he wasn't sure he was ready to take. But the thought of letting her walk away again, of potentially losing this chance to reconnect, was unbearable as she passed his table. Their eyes met. For a brief second, time seemed to stop. Rachel's smile faltered and her expression shifted from confusion to recognition. She froze, her hand clutching the back of her chair as if steadying herself. "Stephen?" Her voice was soft, almost disbelieving. "Rachel," he replied, his voice equally strained. It felt like the air around them had thickened, silencing the world beyond their shared gaze. But before either could say more, the young man approached, his expression curious. "Mom, everything okay?" Stephen turned to him, his chest tightening. The young man's eyes were a mirror of his own. Stephen Mitchell could hardly believe his eyes. Standing before him was Rachel Foster, the woman who had once been the center of his universe. Time had barely touched her. Her presence was as commanding as ever, though there was a maturity in her expression that hadn't been there before. But it wasn't just Rachel. It was the young man beside her, his son. He was certain of it. Though the truth had yet to be spoken aloud, Rachel's voice, soft yet steady, pulled him from his trance. "Stephen, what are you doing here?" It was an innocuous question, but her tone carried layers of meaning. There was shock, confusion, and even a hint of apprehension. Stephen tried to compose himself, offering a faint smile. "I could ask you the same," he replied, his voice betraying the storm of emotions swirling beneath the surface. The young man stepped forward, his gaze moving between Rachel and Stephen. "Mom, who's this?" he asked, his tone cautious but polite. Rachel hesitated, glancing at Stephen as if trying to decide how much to reveal. "This is Stephen Mitchell," she said finally. Her voice held a strange mix of warmth and tension. Turning to Stephen, she added, "And this is my son, Austin." Stephen extended a hand, masking the tremor in his fingers. "It's nice to meet you, Austin," he said, his voice measured. Austin took the offered hand and shook it firmly. "Nice to meet you too," he replied, though his expression was wary. There was an undeniable familiarity in his features, the same strong jawline, the same intensity in his eyes. It was like looking into a reflection of his younger self. The moment hung in the air, thick with unspoken questions and the weight of history. Stephen broke the silence with an attempt at levity. "It seems fate has a sense of humor," he said. "Of all the places in the world, we run into each other here." Rachel gave a soft, uncertain laugh. "It does seem that way," she said, but there was a guardedness in her tone, a wall that had been built over years of hurt and survival. As the evening progressed, Stephen found himself unable to focus on anything but Rachel and Austin. He kept replaying their brief interaction in his mind, analyzing every word, every glance. Rachel's presence had stirred something within him, a mix of regret, longing, and a desperate need for answers. The next morning, he spotted them on the sun deck. Rachel was reading a book, her sunglasses perched on her nose, while Austin leaned against the railing, gazing out at the ocean. Stephen hesitated, unsure if he should approach them. He didn't want to overstep, but the opportunity to reconnect was too precious to ignore. Taking a deep breath, he walked over. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm and friendly. Rachel looked up, her expression a mixture of surprise and mild irritation. "Good morning, Stephen." Austin turned, offering a nod of acknowledgement. "Morning." Stephen gestured toward the empty chair beside Rachel. "Do you mind if I join you?" Rachel hesitated but eventually nodded. "Sure," she said, her tone neutral. Stephen sat down, the tension between them palpable. For a moment, none of them spoke, the only sounds coming from the gentle lapping of the waves and the distant chatter of other passengers. Finally, Stephen broke the silence. "It's been a long time, Rachel," he said, his voice soft. "Too long?" Rachel closed her book and removed her sunglasses, meeting his gaze head-on. "Yes, it has," she said simply. Her eyes held a hint of sadness, but there was also strength, a testament to everything she had endured. Austin, sensing the weight of the conversation, excused himself. "I think I'll grab a drink," he said, leaving Stephen and Rachel alone. Stephen watched him go, his heart aching with a mix of pride and regret. "He's an impressive young man," he said, turning back to Rachel. "You've done an amazing job." Rachel's expression softened slightly. "Thank you," she said. "He's my whole world." There was a pause before Stephen spoke again, his voice tinged with vulnerability. "Rachel, I know I have no right to ask, but is he—" "Yes," Rachel interrupted, her voice firm but not unkind. "Austin is your son." The words hit Stephen like a tidal wave. He had suspected it, but hearing it confirmed was a different reality altogether. He struggled to find the right words, his throat tight with emotion. I didn't know," he said finally. "If I had—" "You would have what?" Rachel's voice was sharper now, her pain surfacing. "Fought for us, stood up to your mother, Or would you have believed her lies, just like you did back then? Stephen flinched at her words but didn't argue. She was right. He had let Deborah's manipulations dictate his actions, and the consequences had been devastating. You're right, he admitted. I failed you. I failed both of you. Rachel's eyes softened, but the hurt was still there. It's not just about me, Stephen, she said. It's about him. For 20 years. He's believed his father was dead. How do you expect him to process this? Stephen nodded, his resolve hardening. I don't know, he said honestly, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to be part of his life, if you'll let me. Rachel studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she sighed. I don't know if I can trust you, Stephen, she said, but for Austin's sake, I'll give you a chance. The morning after their emotionally charged conversation, Stephen Mitchell woke early, his mind racing. The revelation that Austin was his son filled him with both excitement and dread. He wanted to know everything about the young man, his interests, his dreams, the life he'd lived without him. But Rachel's words still echoed in his mind. For 20 years, he's believed his father was dead. How do you expect him to process this? Stephen needed to tread carefully. He made his way to the ship's cafe, hoping to gather his thoughts over a strong cup of coffee. As fate would have it, Austin was already there, sitting alone at a small table near the window, scrolling through his phone. Stephen hesitated, then approached cautiously. Mind if I join you? He asked, keeping his tone light. Austin glanced up, surprised but not unfriendly. Sure, he said, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. Stephen sat down, studying the young man up close. It was uncanny how much Austin reminded him of himself at that age. The same sharp features, the same intensity in his eyes, but there was something different about him too. A quiet confidence that Stephen envied. What's got you up so early? Stephen asked, breaking the silence. Austin shrugged. I'm an early riser. Besides, it's hard to sleep when the ocean's right outside your window. Stephen chuckled. Fair point. I'm the same way. Always liked the quiet hours of the morning. For a while, they talked about small things. The ship's amenities, the itinerary, the food. Stephen learned that Austin was studying engineering, specializing in sustainable energy. The pride in his voice when he spoke of his studies was unmistakable, and Stephen couldn't help but feel a swell of admiration. You've got a bright future ahead of you, Stephen said sincerely. Your mom must be really proud. Austin smiled, a genuine but slightly bashful expression. She is. She's sacrificed a lot to get me where I am. Stephen's chest tightened. He knew Rachel had carried the burden of raising Austin alone, and the weight of his absence felt heavier than ever. She's an incredible woman, he said softly. You're lucky to have her. I know, Austin replied, his tone serious. She's always been there for me. I just wish she didn't have to do it all on her own. Stephen's breath caught. Austin's words were a reminder of the years he'd missed, the moments he could never get back, but they were also an opening, a chance to show Austin that he was here now, ready to make amends. Later that day, Stephen found himself on the promenade deck, watching the waves roll by. He had been avoiding Rachel, unsure of how to navigate the delicate balance between her lingering distrust and his desire to prove himself. But as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold, she appeared beside him, as if drawn by the same magnetic pull. You've been spending a lot of time with Austin, Rachel remarked, her voice neutral. Stephen turned to her, his expression earnest. I want to get to know him. Rachel, I want to be a part of his life, she sighed, crossing her arms as she leaned against the railing. It's not that simple, Stephen. He's not a child. He has his own life, his own beliefs. You can't just show up after 20 years and expect everything to fall into place. I know, Stephen admitted, but I'm willing to take it one step at a time. I'm not asking for forgiveness overnight. I just want the chance to try. Rachel studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Do you know what hurts the most? She said finally. It's not just that you weren't there, it's that you believed her. You believed your mother over me? Stephen lowered his gaze, shame flooding him. I was a coward, he said quietly. I let her manipulate me because I was too afraid to stand up to her. But I'm not that man anymore, Rachel. I've changed. Have you? She asked, her tone challenging. Stephen met her gaze, his voice steady. "Yes, and I'll prove it to you." As the days passed, Stephen continued to spend time with Austin, careful not to overwhelm him. They bonded over shared interests, sports, travel, even a love for classic films. Stephen marveled at how natural it felt to talk to him, as if they'd known each other all along. But beneath the surface, he knew the truth couldn't stay hidden forever. Sooner or later, Austin would have to know. One evening, as they played a game of pool in the ship's lounge, Austin glanced at Stephen with a curious expression. "You're a good guy, Mr. Mitchell," he said, "but I can't shake the feeling that there's more to why you're spending so much time with us." Stephen froze, the cue stick hovering over the table. "What do you mean?" he asked carefully. Austin shrugged, his gaze piercing. "I don't know. It just feels like you're, I don't know, trying to make up for something." Stephen's throat tightened. He wasn't ready to reveal the truth. Not yet. "Maybe I am," he said finally, his voice quiet. "But that's not a bad thing, is it?" Austin considered this, then nodded slowly. "No, I guess not." That night, as Stephen lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he knew the clock was ticking. The bond he was building with Austin was fragile, and the longer he waited to tell the truth, the greater the risk of losing everything. He couldn't afford to waste another moment. Stephen Mitchell woke early the next morning, his mind restless and weighed down by the decision he knew he had to make. He couldn't keep circling around the truth. The more time he spent with Austin, the more certain he became that their bond would only strengthen if the truth were brought to light. Yet, fear clawed at him. Fear of rejection, fear of Rachel's mistrust, and most of all, fear of losing the chance to be a part of his son's life. After breakfast, he found Rachel alone on the observation deck, her hair swaying gently in the ocean breeze. She seemed lost in thought, gazing out at the horizon. Stephen approached cautiously, his heart hammering in his chest. "Rachel," he began, his voice breaking the quiet. "Can we talk?" She glanced at him, her expression guarded. "Isn't that all we've been doing lately?" Stephen allowed himself a faint smile, though his tone remained serious. "I mean really talk. About Austin. About everything." Rachel sighed and turned to face him fully, crossing her arms defensively. "What do you want me to say, Stephen? That it's easy for me to see you with him. That it doesn't hurt to watch you bond with a son you didn't even know existed." Stephen's voice softened. "I'm not trying to take anything from you. I know you've been everything to him. His mother, his father, his whole world. I just want to understand, to know what really happened." Rachel hesitated, her eyes scanning his face for sincerity. Finally, she exhaled and motioned for him to sit beside her on one of the benches. "You want to know what happened?" she said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Fine, let me tell you." Rachel's story unfolded like a wound reopening, each word laced with pain. She spoke of how Deborah Mitchell had cornered her in the days leading up to her departure, how she'd been accused of trying to trap Stephen with a pregnancy she hadn't even known about at the time, how Deborah had threatened to destroy her life, using money, influence, and fabricated evidence to paint her as unfaithful. "She told me I wasn't good enough for you," Rachel said, her voice trembling with the memory, "that I'd ruin your future. And I believed her, Stephen. I believed her because she was so cruel, so calculated, and I didn't know how to fight back." Stephen clenched his fists, anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. "I should have protected you," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I should have known what she was capable of." Rachel shook her head. "You were young, Stephen. You trusted her, like any son would. But the truth is, she didn't just take me away from you. She took you away from us." Stephen swallowed hard, his throat tightening. "When did you know you were pregnant?" he asked gently. Rachel gave a sad smile. "Not until after I'd left. By then, it was too late. I didn't have your number. Your mother made sure of that. And when I tried to write you, the letters came back unopened. She cut off every avenue I had to reach you." Stephen stared at her, his heart aching with the weight of her words. "I didn't know, Rachel. I swear to you, I didn't know. I believe you," Rachel said softly. "But it doesn't change what happened." The sound of approaching footsteps broke their conversation. They turned to see Austin walking toward them, his easy smile faltering slightly when he noticed the tension in their faces. "Am I interrupting something?" he asked, glancing between them. Stephen forced a smile. shaking his head. Not at all, we were just talking. Austin raised an eyebrow. Talking about what? Stephen hesitated, searching for the right words. About you, actually. Me. Austin's expression shifted to one of mild curiosity. What about me? Rachel quickly intervened, her tone light but firm. Just about how proud I am of you, that's all. Austin smiled, clearly pleased by the sentiment, but Stephen could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. The young man wasn't naive. He could sense there was more to the story. Well, in that case, Austin said, I'll let you get back to it. I'm meeting some friends from the cruise. We're going snorkeling later. Have fun, Rachel said, watching as he walked away. When Austin was out of earshot, Stephen turned to Rachel, his voice low. He's going to find out eventually, Rachel. Don't you think he deserves to know the truth? Rachel's jaw tightened. And what do you expect me to say? Stephen, that I lied to him his whole life, that the father he thought was dead has been alive all along. He deserves to hear it from us. Stephen pressed. Not from someone else? Not from my mother if she tries to intervene again. Rachel's expression darkened at the mention of Deborah. She's not going to touch him, she said fiercely. I won't let her. Then let's do this together, Stephen urged. Let's tell him the truth. Rachel hesitated, her resolve wavering. Finally, she nodded, though her face remained etched with worry. Not yet, she said. Give me a little more time. Stephen nodded, understanding the enormity of what she was agreeing to. Whenever you're ready, he said. I'll be here. That night, as Stephen lay in bed, he felt a flicker of hope amid the turmoil. Rachel's agreement was a small step, but it was a step forward, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that redemption might still be possible. The days on the cruise seemed to blur together, as Stephen Mitchell cautiously navigated his fragile reconnection with Rachel and Austin. He found himself gravitating toward the ship's quieter spaces, where he could collect his thoughts. The library became a frequent refuge, its walls lined with leather-bound books and soft lighting, offering a calm contrast to the vibrant energy of the ship. It was here that Stephen spotted Austin again. Seated at a corner table, a book propped open in front of him, Stephen hesitated, not wanting to intrude, but Austin caught his eye and waved him over. Hey, Mr. Mitchell, Austin greeted casually as Stephen approached. Didn't think you were the library type. Stephen chuckled as he sat down. I guess I'm full of surprises. Austin smirked, his expression more relaxed than Stephen had seen before. What brings you here? Stephen gestured to the book in Austin's hands. I could ask you the same thing. What are you reading? Austin held up the cover, revealing a book on engineering principles. It's for my coursework, he explained. I figured I might as well get ahead while I've got the time. Stephen nodded. Impressed. You've got a good head on your shoulders. I can see your mom's influence in you. Austin's expression softened at the mention of Rachel. She's the reason I'm even here. She worked 2 jobs to make sure I could go to college. I owe her everything. Stephen felt a pang of guilt at the unspoken implication. Rachel had carried the burden he should have shared, and Austin had grown up without the father figure he clearly respected and admired. Stephen didn't want to disrupt the delicate balance of their relationship, but every moment he spent with Austin made him yearn to bridge the gap between them. You're lucky to have her, Stephen said earnestly. She's an incredible woman. Austin nodded, his tone wistful. She really is, but sometimes I wonder if she sacrificed too much. She's never had anyone in her life, at least not since my dad. Stephen swallowed hard, the weight of Austin's words settling heavily on his shoulders. She did what she thought was best for you, he said carefully. And, from what I can see, she's done an amazing job. Austin smiled faintly, but there was a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. You seem to know her pretty well. Were you two friends or something? Stephen hesitated, his heart racing. He wanted to tell Austin the truth, but knew it wasn't his place. Not yet. We knew each other a long time ago, he said simply. She's always been someone I admired. Austin studied him for a moment, as if weighing the sincerity of his words. Then he nodded, his curiosity seemingly satisfied. For now. Later that evening, Stephen joined Rachel on the promenade deck, where she often went to watch the sunset. The sky was a canvas of vibrant oranges and purples, and the air carried the faint scent of salt and tropical flowers. Rachel stood with her arms crossed, gazing out at the horizon, her posture relaxed but her expression contemplative. "You've been spending a lot of time with Austin," she remarked as Stephen approached. Stephen stopped beside her, leaning against the railing. "He's an impressive young man. You've raised him well." Rachel glanced at him, her gaze softening slightly. "He's a good kid, but I'm not sure he's ready for what you want to tell him." Stephen sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know it's a lot to process. I don't want to waste any more time." Rachel's voice was quiet but firm. "Stephen, if you rush this, you could lose him before you even have a chance. He's not just going to accept you overnight. He's spent his entire life believing his father was gone." Stephen nodded, her words resonating deeply. "You're right," he admitted. "But every time I look at him, I see the years I missed. I want to be there for him now, Rachel, even if it's just as a friend." Rachel turned to face him fully, her expression unreadable. "Do you mean that?" she asked. "That you'd be content just being his friend?" Stephen met her gaze, his voice steady. "If that's all he's willing to give me, then yes, I'd rather have a piece of his life than nothing at all." Rachel studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay," she said. "Let's take it one step at a time." As the days passed, Stephen found small ways to connect with Austin without overstepping. They shared meals, played games in the ship's lounge, and even joined a group excursion to a private beach. With each interaction, Stephen learned more about the young man Austin had become, his sharp mind, his sense of humor, and his quiet determination to succeed. One afternoon, while they were snorkeling off the coast of a small island, Stephen watched as Austin dived fearlessly into the clear blue water, retrieving shells and pointing out fish with an infectious enthusiasm. It was a side of him Stephen hadn't seen before, and it filled him with pride. As they returned to the ship that evening, Austin turned to Stephen, a genuine smile on his face. "Thanks for coming today," he said. "It was fun having you there." Stephen felt a lump form in his throat. "The pleasure was all mine," he said. "You've got a real gift for making people feel welcome, Austin. Don't lose that." Austin laughed, shaking his head. "I guess I get that from my mom." Stephen smiled, though his heart ached with the knowledge that he couldn't yet tell Austin how much he truly meant those words. For now, he would have to be patient. The time for truth would come. Stephen Mitchell sat alone on the deck late at night, the warm breeze tugging at his shirt as the ocean stretched endlessly into the darkness. The day's events played over in his mind. Austin's laughter during their snorkeling trip, Rachel's guarded glances, and the ever-present weight of the truth he hadn't yet shared. The silence around him was broken only by the rhythmic sound of waves against the hull, yet his thoughts were anything but calm. His solitude didn't last long. Footsteps approached, and when he turned, he saw Rachel. She held a light shawl around her shoulders, her expression unreadable as she joined him. "I thought I'd find you here," she said quietly, sitting down in the chair beside him. Stephen offered her a faint smile. "Couldn't sleep." Rachel nodded, pulling her shawl tighter. "Me neither." For a while they sat in silence, both staring out at the vast expanse of water. Finally, Rachel broke the quiet. "Austin's starting to trust you," she said, her tone thoughtful. "I can see it in the way he talks about you." Stephen turned to her, his expression hopeful. "You think so?" Rachel nodded but didn't meet his gaze. "That's what makes this so hard. He's opening up to you, Stephen, and I know how much that means to you. But the truth, it's going to change everything. For him, for you, for all of us." Stephen sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. "I know," he admitted, "and I know I can't rush it, but every day that passes, it feels like I'm lying to him by not telling him." Rachel finally looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and determination. "Then maybe it's time." The next morning, Rachel invited Austin to join her and Stephen for breakfast in one of the ship's quieter dining areas. Austin seemed surprised by the invitation but agreed. Sitting across from Stephen at the table, the conversation began light, with talk of their plans for the day and shared observations about the cruise. But as the meal progressed, the mood shifted. Rachel set down her fork and glanced at Stephen. Giving him a subtle nod, Stephen's heart pounded, and he took a deep breath before speaking. "Austin," he began carefully, "there's something important your mom and I need to talk to you about." Austin looked up, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Okay, what's going on?" Rachel reached across the table, placing a hand on her son's arm. "This isn't easy for me to say, but you deserve to know the truth about your father." Austin's confusion deepened, and he sat back in his chair, his expression guarded. "I thought we already talked about this. He died before I was born, right?" Rachel hesitated, glancing at Stephen before continuing. "That's what I told you," she said softly. "But it wasn't the whole truth." Austin's eyes darted between them, suspicion creeping into his tone. "What are you saying?" Stephen leaned forward, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Austin, your father isn't dead. He's me." For a moment, the words seemed to hang in the air, unreal and impossible. Austin stared at Stephen, his face a mixture of shock, disbelief, and anger. "What?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Rachel's grip on his arm tightened. "I know this is a lot to take in," she said gently. "But it's the truth. Stephen is your father." Austin pushed back his chair, standing abruptly. "You've got to be kidding me," he said, his voice rising. "Is this some kind of joke?" Stephen stood as well, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "It's not a joke, Austin. I didn't know. If I'd known about you, I would've—" "You would've what?" Austin snapped, his face flushed with emotion. "Been there for me? Been a dad? Because guess what? I didn't need one. I had my mom, and she did just fine without you." Stephen flinched at the words but held his ground. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said quietly, "but I want to try. I want to be a part of your life, if you'll let me." Austin shook his head, his voice shaking with anger. "You don't just get to show up after 20 years and decide you want to be my dad. It doesn't work like that." "Austin," Rachel said softly, tears in her eyes. "Please, just listen." "No," Austin interrupted, his voice firm. "You lied to me, Mom. My whole life you lied." Before either of them could respond, Austin turned and stormed out of the dining room, leaving Stephen and Rachel sitting in stunned silence. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Stephen spent hours walking the ship's decks, replaying the confrontation in his mind. He wanted to give Austin space, but the fear of losing him completely gnawed at him. Rachel, too, was distraught, her guilt over hiding the truth weighing heavily on her. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Stephen found Austin on the bow of the ship, leaning against the railing with his arms crossed. He approached cautiously, unsure if he'd be welcomed or pushed away. "Austin," he said quietly, stopping a few feet away. "Can we talk?" Austin didn't turn around. "What's there to talk about? You lied. She lied. What else is there to say?" Stephen stepped closer, his voice steady. "I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But please, let me explain." Austin finally turned, his expression a mixture of hurt and defiance. "Why now?" he demanded. "Why bother telling me now?" Stephen met his gaze, his own eyes filled with pain. "Because I didn't want to lie to you anymore. Because you deserve to know the truth. And because I want the chance to make things right, if you'll let me." Austin stared at him for a long moment, his emotions warring behind his eyes. Finally, he shook his head, his voice barely audible. "I don't know if I can do this." And with that, he walked away, leaving Stephen alone with the sound of the ocean and the weight of his regrets. Stephen Mitchell felt the weight of the previous day's confrontation like a stone in his chest. The sound of Austin's hurtful words lingered, replaying in his mind as he sat on the edge of his bed. He had known it wouldn't be easy to tell the truth, but the raw anger and betrayal in Austin's eyes had been more than he anticipated. Stephen wasn't sure how to move forward, but he was certain of one thing. He couldn't give up. Not now. After hours of pacing and pondering, he decided to focus on the one person who might help him find clarity. Rachel, she too had been shaken by the confrontation, and Stephen could see the toll it had taken on her. He found her in the ship's quiet lounge, nursing a cup of tea, her face drawn with exhaustion. "You look like you've been through a war," Stephen said gently, taking the seat across from her. Rachel offered a faint smile, but didn't respond right away. After a moment, she sighed. "It feels like it. Stephen, I've spent 20 years protecting Austin, trying to give him the best life I could. And now I feel like I've destroyed everything we had." "You haven't," Stephen said firmly. "He's angry, yes, but he loves you, Rachel. That hasn't changed." Rachel stared into her tea, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just don't know if I did the right thing." Stephen leaned forward, his tone gentle but resolute. "You did what you thought was best for him. You gave him stability, love, and a future. That's more than most kids ever get. But now, it's time for him to know the whole story." Rachel looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "And what about you? What are you going to do now?" Stephen hesitated, then said, "I want to make things right. Not just with Austin, but with you too. And that starts with understanding what happened all those years ago. I need to know everything, Rachel." Later that day, the two of them retreated to Rachel's cabin, where she pulled out a worn shoebox filled with letters, photographs, and mementos from her past. Stephen sat across from her, his heart heavy as she opened the box and began to piece together the story of how their lives had been torn apart. Rachel handed him a stack of letters, unopened and still in their original envelopes. "I wrote to you," she said quietly, "dozens of times. I begged for you to hear me out, to give me a chance to explain. But every letter I sent came back. Return to sender. Your mother made sure I couldn't reach you." Stephen turned the letters over in his hands, his stomach churning with guilt and fury. "She never told me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I thought you'd moved on, that you didn't care." Rachel shook her head, her expression pained. "I never stopped caring, Stephen, but I couldn't fight her. I didn't have the resources, the power, and then, when I found out I was pregnant, I knew I had to focus on Austin. He became my whole world." Stephen's hands trembled as he set the letters aside. "And my mother, she knew about him, didn't she?" Rachel hesitated, then nodded. "I'm sure she did. She made it clear that she'd do whatever it took to keep us apart, and I believed her." Stephen's jaw tightened, a surge of anger bubbling up within him. Deborah Mitchell had always been a controlling force in his life, but this was beyond anything he had imagined. She hadn't just manipulated him. She had stolen his family, his future. "Why didn't you try again?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Why didn't you come back?" Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "I thought about it, Stephen, 100 times, but every time I considered it, I remembered the way you looked at me the last time we spoke, like you didn't believe me, like I wasn't worth fighting for." Stephen flinched, her words cutting deep. "I was a coward," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "I let her control me because it was easier than standing up to her, and I've regretted it every day since." Rachel reached across the table, placing a hand over his. "You can't change the past, Stephen, but maybe we can find a way forward." That evening, Stephen found himself alone on the deck, staring out at the horizon as the ship glided through calm waters. His mind raced with everything Rachel had told him, each piece of the puzzle falling into place. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. His mother had manipulated not just Rachel, but him as well. And if Deborah had known about Austin all along, she was capable of far more than he had ever realized. He resolved to confront her as soon as they returned to the mainland. But first, he needed to find a way to reach Austin. As if on cue, Austin appeared on the far side of the deck, leaning against the railing with his hands in his pockets. Stephen hesitated, then walked over, his steps slow and deliberate. "Hey," Stephen said cautiously, stopping a few feet away. Austin glanced at him, his expression unreadable. "Hey." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Stephen broke the silence. "I know you're angry and I don't blame you. You have every right to be." Austin didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the dark water below. "I just want you to know," Stephen continued, his voice steady, "that I'm here, for you, no matter what." Austin finally turned to him, his eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and confusion. "Why now?" he asked. "Why does it matter so much to you all of a sudden?" Stephen took a deep breath. "Because I've spent 20 years living with the regret of losing you and your mom, and now that I have the chance to make it right, I can't let it slip away. I don't expect you to forgive me, Austin, but I hope you'll give me a chance." Austin studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I don't know if I'm ready to trust you," he said honestly, "but I guess we can start with this." Stephen smiled, a flicker of hope igniting in his chest. That's all I could ask for. The days following their conversation were delicate. Stephen knew that Austin's willingness to give him a chance was tentative at best, and he tread lightly, careful not to overwhelm him. Meanwhile, Rachel seemed to watch from the sidelines, her protective instincts on high alert as she observed the fragile bond forming between father and son. Stephen decided that actions, not words, would be the way forward. He started small, inviting Austin to join him for activities around the ship, a game of chess in the lounge, a quiet dinner at one of the smaller restaurants, or even just sitting together on the deck as the ship cruised through endless blue waters. One afternoon, Stephen suggested they try the ship's rock-climbing wall. To his surprise, Austin agreed, though his skepticism was clear. "You rock climbing," he teased. "Are you sure you're up for it, old man?" Stephen chuckled, appreciating the light-hearted jab. "Don't underestimate me," he replied. "I might surprise you." Austin raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced, but followed him to the wall nonetheless. At the climbing wall, Austin scaled the structure with the ease of someone young and athletic, reaching the top in record time. Stephen, on the other hand, struggled. Halfway up, his grip slipped, and he dangled awkwardly from the harness, eliciting laughter from Austin below. "Need a hand, Mr. Mitchell," Austin called, smirking. Stephen laughed despite himself. "I've got this," he said, though his arms burned with the effort. By the time he reached the top, Austin was waiting for him, a triumphant grin on his face. "Not bad," he said as Stephen caught his breath. "For an old guy." Stephen clapped him on the shoulder, shaking his head with mock exasperation. "You're enjoying this way too much." "Maybe," Austin admitted, his grin softening into a genuine smile. "But it was fun. Thanks for suggesting it." Stephen felt a surge of hope at those words. It was a small victory, but it felt significant. A moment of connection, unburdened by the weight of the past. Later that evening, Stephen joined Rachel for a drink at the ship's piano bar. The dimly lit room was alive with the soft hum of conversation and the gentle strains of a jazz pianist in the corner. Rachel sipped a glass of red wine, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp as she listened to Stephen recount the day's events. "He actually smiled," Stephen said, his tone tinged with both surprise and pride. "A real smile. I didn't think I'd see that so soon." Rachel tilted her head, a small smile playing on her lips. "Austin's a good kid," she said. "He's resilient, but don't mistake progress for forgiveness, Stephen. He's still processing everything." "I know," Stephen replied, his expression sobering. "I just want to give him reasons to trust me, to believe that I'm here for him, for both of you." Rachel studied him for a moment, her eyes softening. "You've been trying, Stephen. I can see that, and I think he can too, and I think. But this isn't something you can rush." "I'm not trying to rush it," Stephen assured her. I want to make up for lost time." Rachel set her glass down, her voice quiet but firm. "You can't make up for 20 years in a week, but you can start building something new one day at a time." Stephen nodded, her words resonating deeply. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere, "for giving me this chance, for letting me try." Rachel smiled faintly, her gaze dropping to her glass. "You're welcome. Just don't make me regret it." The next day, Austin joined Stephen for breakfast, their conversation surprisingly relaxed. They talked about everything from Austin's studies to the places he wanted to travel. Stephen listened intently, marveling at how driven and thoughtful Austin was. He could see so much of Rachel in him, her determination, her kindness, but there were glimpses of himself too, in the way Austin analyzed situations and approached problems with a practical mindset. At one point, Austin hesitated, his expression shifting to something more serious. "Can I ask you something?" he said, his tone cautious. "Of course," Stephen replied. "Why now?" Austin asked, meeting Stephen's gaze directly. "Why are you here now, trying to be part of my life?" Stephen took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Because I didn't know about you," he said honestly. "And if I'd known, things would have been different. But now that I do know, I can't walk away. You're my son, Austin, and I want to be here for you, for as long as you'll let me." Austin studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded, though his tone remained guarded. "I guess I can understand that, but it's going to take time. You can't just show up and expect everything to be fine." "I know," Stephen said. "And I don't expect that. I just want the chance to prove to you that I mean it." Austin didn't respond immediately, but the tension in his posture seemed to ease. "Okay," he said finally. "We'll see." That evening, Rachel pulled Stephen aside after dinner, her expression both hopeful and cautious. "He told me you talked this morning," she said, "that he's willing to give you a chance." Stephen smiled, relief washing over him. "That's all I could ask for." Rachel nodded, her voice soft. "Just don't mess it up, Stephen. He's been through enough." Stephen met her gaze, his voice steady. "I won't." And for the first time in years, he truly believed it. The tension Stephen Mitchell had been carrying since the cruise began started to loosen. But he knew the fragile progress he'd made with Austin and Rachel was far from secure. Each interaction with his son felt like a step forward, yet the shadow of the past still lingered. That shadow, he realized, was cast by his mother, Deborah Mitchell. The deeper he delved into his memories, the more convinced he became that Deborah's manipulations had reached further than even Rachel knew. Stephen stood on the deck one morning, sipping his coffee and staring at the endless stretch of ocean. The gentle waves should have been calming, but his mind was restless. He replayed the pieces of Rachel's story in his head, the returned letters, the threats, and the isolating tactics that had kept them apart. If Deborah had been willing to go to such lengths, what else might she have hidden? The sound of approaching footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see Rachel, her hair caught in the breeze, a look of concern etched on her face. "You're up early," she said, joining him by the railing. Stephen offered a faint smile. "Couldn't sleep. Too much on my mind." Rachel studied him for a moment, her expression softening. "Austin?" Stephen nodded. "Him, you, everything. I just keep thinking about my mother, about how much damage she's done." Rachel crossed her arms, leaning against the railing. "She did everything she could to keep us apart. I don't think I've ever met someone so determined to control every aspect of her son's life." Stephen sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not just control, it's manipulation, deceit. She's always had a way of making people believe whatever she wanted them to. I can't help but wonder how far she went." Rachel hesitated, then said, "Do you think she knew about Austin? That she kept it from you on purpose?" Stephen turned to her, his jaw tightening. "I don't think. I know. She had to have known. Deborah Mitchell doesn't leave loose ends." Rachel looked away, her voice quiet. "Then maybe it's time to confront her." The idea of facing his mother sent a ripple of unease through Stephen. Deborah was a formidable woman, even in her advancing years. She had built an empire and maintained her iron grip over the Mitchell family for decades. Stephen had always felt like a pawn in her grander schemes, and the thought of challenging her now filled him with both determination and dread. Later that day, Stephen found himself seated in one of the ship's lounges with Rachel and Austin. The three of them were playing cards. A surprisingly relaxed moment in an otherwise emotionally charged trip. Austin was focused on the game, his competitive streak bringing a smile to Rachel's face. "You're going to lose this round, Mom," Austin teased, laying down his cards triumphantly. Rachel groaned, shaking her head. "You're impossible," she said with a laugh. Stephen watched them, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and longing. He didn't want to shatter this newfound harmony, but he knew the time was approaching when he would need to take the next step. As the game ended, Austin excused himself to meet friends he'd made on the cruise. Stephen and Rachel remained behind, the playful atmosphere giving way to a more serious tone. "I need to talk to her," Stephen said abruptly. Rachel blinked, surprised. "Your mother?" Stephen nodded, his expression resolute. "I can't move forward until I know the truth. I need to hear it from her. Why she did it, what she was thinking, and if she knew about Austin. I need to confront her about that too." Rachel hesitated, her concern evident. "Do you think she'll tell you the truth?" Stephen's jaw tightened. "She won't have a choice. Not this time." The following day, Stephen made the call. Deborah's assistant answered, her polished voice familiar after years of facilitating Deborah's meticulously scheduled life. "Good morning, Mr. Mitchell," she greeted. "How can I assist you?" "I need to speak with my mother," Stephen said curtly. "It's urgent." There was a brief pause before the assistant replied. "Of course, sir. One moment." Stephen paced the deck as he waited, the phone pressed tightly to his ear. When Deborah's voice finally came through, it was as cold and commanding as he remembered. "Stephen," she said, her tone clipped. "I wasn't expecting a call. To what do I owe the pleasure?" Stephen wasted no time. "We need to talk, Mother. About Rachel, about Austin." There was a long silence on the other end of the line when Deborah finally spoke. Her voice was sharp. "I see. So, you found her?" "Yes," Stephen replied. "And I know what you did. I know how you kept us apart." Deborah's laugh was low and humorless. "Stephen, you were young and foolish. I did what I had to do to protect you from making a mistake." "A mistake?" Stephen's voice rose, his anger boiling over. "Rachel wasn't a mistake, Mother. She was the best thing that ever happened to me and Austin. He's my son, you knew, didn't you?" Another silence. This one stretched uncomfortably long before Deborah finally spoke. "Yes," she admitted, her tone unrepentant. "I knew." Stephen gripped the railing, his knuckles white. "How could you? How could you keep that from me?" Deborah's voice remained cold. "Because you weren't ready, Stephen. You would have thrown your life away for a girl who wasn't worthy of you. I did what any mother would do." Stephen's chest tightened, his fury and disbelief threatening to overwhelm him. "You didn't do it for me. You did it for yourself. To keep control. To keep your perfect little world intact." Deborah's silence was her only response, but Stephen didn't need her to confirm it. He had heard enough. "This is the last time you'll interfere in my life," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "I'm done letting you control me, and if you try to come between me and my family again, I'll make sure you regret it." With that, he ended the call, his hands trembling as he set the phone down. The confrontation had left him shaken, but it had also given him clarity. Deborah's power over him was broken. Now, he could focus on rebuilding the relationships that truly mattered. Stephen Mitchell hadn't slept well since his confrontation with Deborah. The weight of her admission, that she had knowingly kept Rachel and Austin from him, gnawed at his thoughts. As he sat alone in the ship's cafe, sipping a lukewarm cup of coffee, he realized there was more to the story than his mother had let on. Her ability to manipulate and deceive was unparalleled, but she hadn't acted alone. He knew that now. The memory of a strained conversation with his older brother, Adam Mitchell, resurfaced. It had been years ago during a holiday gathering at the family estate. Stephen had been lamenting the loss of Rachel, a rare moment of vulnerability in front of his guarded and competitive sibling. Adam's response had been dismissive, almost smug. At the time, Stephen had chalked it up to Adam's usual arrogance. But now he wondered, had Adam been more involved than he realized? Determined to find out, Stephen pulled out his phone and dialed his brother's number. It rang several times before Adam answered, his tone clipped and impatient. "Stephen, this is a surprise." Stephen leaned back in his chair, forcing a calm he didn't feel. "We need to talk." Adam's pause was brief but telling. "About what?" "About Rachel," Stephen said, his voice steady. "And Austin." There was another pause, longer this time. When Adam spoke again, his tone was colder. "What about them?" "I spoke to Mother," Stephen continued, ignoring the edge in Adam's voice. "She admitted to keeping Rachel away from me. But I think there's more to the story. I think you were involved." Adam let out a sharp laugh, though there was no humor in it. "You've always been good at pointing fingers, haven't you? Always looking for someone to blame for your mistakes." "This isn't about blame," Stephen said firmly. "It's about the truth. So tell me, Adam, what did you do?" The conversation with Adam replayed in Stephen's mind as he paced the ship's deck. Later that evening, Adam hadn't confessed outright, but his defensive tone and evasive answers had confirmed Stephen's suspicions. His brother had been complicit in Deborah's schemes. Likely motivated by the same jealousy and ambition that had defined their relationship since childhood, Stephen's thoughts were interrupted by Rachel, who approached him with a concerned expression. "You've been quiet all day," she said. "What's going on?" Stephen hesitated, then told her about his call with Adam. Rachel listened intently, her brow furrowing as he recounted the details. "I always had a feeling about him," Rachel said when Stephen finished. "He was always so smug, like he knew something I didn't." Stephen nodded, his jaw tightening. "He probably did. Adam's always wanted to outshine me, to prove he's better. Keeping you and Austin away from me, it was probably just another way to win." Rachel shook her head, disbelief and anger flashing in her eyes. Your family is unbelievable. They were, Stephen corrected. Not anymore. Rachel gave him a long look, her expression softening. What are you going to do? Stephen exhaled, his resolve hardening. I'm going to confront him face to face. No more hiding behind phone calls or excuses. When the cruise docked 2 days later, Stephen wasted no time. He booked a flight to Los Angeles, where Adam lived in a sprawling mansion perched in the Hollywood Hills. The journey felt surreal, his emotions vacillating between anger and anticipation. By the time he arrived at Adam's home, the setting sun bathed the city in golden light, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside Stephen. Adam greeted him at the door, his expression carefully neutral. Stephen, he said, stepping aside to let him in. Sighed. To what do I owe the pleasure? Stephen didn't bother with pleasantries. We need to talk now. Adam's smirk faltered, but he gestured for Stephen to follow him into the living room. The space was sleek and modern, every detail curated to perfection, just like Adam's image. What's this about? Adam asked. Sinking into an armchair with feigned nonchalance, Stephen remained standing, his arms crossed. You know exactly what this is about, Rachel, Austin. The lies you helped Mother spread to keep them away from me. Adam's smirk returned, though it was tinged with discomfort. Stephen, you're being dramatic. Mother handled the situation. I had nothing to do with it. Don't lie to me, Adam, Stephen snapped. I know you. I know how far you'd go to get what you want. Adam's facade cracked, his eyes narrowing. And what exactly do you think I wanted? Stephen's voice was low but firm. Control, power, the family business. You knew Rachel made me happy, and you couldn't stand it, so you helped Mother get rid of her. For a moment, Adam said nothing, his jaw tightening. Then, to Stephen's shock, he laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. You really think this was all about you, don't you? He said. Like the world revolves around Stephen Mitchell. Then tell me the truth, Stephen demanded. Why did you do it? Adam's laughter faded, replaced by a cold glare. Because Mother asked me to. Because she said you were too weak to make the right decision. And because, quite frankly, I didn't care. Rachel was a distraction, Stephen. She was holding you back and we both knew it. Stephen stared at his brother, a mix of disbelief and fury coursing through him. You ruined my life, he said quietly. You took my family away from me. For what? To prove a point? Adam shrugged, unrepentant. You weren't ready for a family, Stephen. You should be thanking me. Stephen's fists clenched, but he forced himself to stay calm. I'll never forgive you for what you did, he said. But I'm done letting you or Mother control me. Rachel and Austin are my family now, and there's nothing you can do to change that. Adam's smirk returned, but it lacked its usual confidence. We'll see, he said, though his tone betrayed his unease. Stephen turned and walked out without another word, leaving his brother behind. The confrontation had been painful, but it had also solidified his resolve. No matter what Deborah or Adam tried, they couldn't take away what mattered most, his chance to rebuild the life he'd lost. Stephen Mitchell arrived back in New York feeling exhausted but resolute. The confrontation with Adam had left a bitter taste in his mouth, but it also solidified his determination. His family's betrayal ran deeper than he had imagined, but they no longer had power over him. His priority now was to protect Rachel and Austin from any further interference and to build the relationship with them that had been stolen from him. The evening after his return, Stephen found himself on a video call with Rachel. She was sitting in her living room, the warm glow of a lamp illuminating her tired but beautiful features. How did it go? She asked cautiously, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Stephen sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. About as well as I expected. Adam denied everything at first, but I got him to admit his involvement. He didn't even seem to care. To him, it was all about control, about proving himself to Mother. Rachel shook her head, her expression a mixture of frustration and sadness. I can't believe he would go along with something like that. I mean, I can. He always had that smug superiority about him. But to hurt you like this, it's not just me he hurt, Stephen said, his voice hardening. He hurt you. He hurt Austin. And the worst part is, I think he still believes he was doing the right thing. Rachel leaned closer to the screen, her gaze softening. You did the right thing by confronting him, Stephen. But now it's time to focus on what really matters. Us, Austin. He needs you more than ever. Stephen nodded, her words grounding him. You're right. He's my priority now. The next morning, Stephen invited Rachel and Austin to his Manhattan apartment for dinner. He wanted to create a space where they could talk openly and begin the process of healing. Rachel was hesitant at first, worried about how Austin might react. But eventually, she agreed. When they arrived that evening, Austin looked around the sleek, modern space with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. This place is nice, he said, his tone guarded. Stephen smiled, sensing the tension beneath the surface. Thanks. I've lived here for years, but it's always felt empty. Austin gave a slight nod, but his expression remained unreadable. Rachel, sensing the awkwardness, placed a reassuring hand on Austin's shoulder before taking a seat at the dining table. Dinner started quietly, the clinking of silverware and the faint hum of the city below filling the silence. Stephen made an effort to keep the conversation light, asking Austin about his studies and Rachel about her work. Slowly, the atmosphere began to relax. It wasn't until dessert that the conversation turned serious. Austin set down his fork and looked directly at Stephen. So, what happens now? Stephen met his gaze, his voice steady. What happens now is up to you, Austin. I want to be part of your life, but I know I have to earn that. I'm not asking for forgiveness overnight. I just want a chance. Austin was quiet for a moment, his brow furrowed in thought. Finally, he spoke. It's hard to trust you, he admitted. Not because of who you are, but because of what you represent. For 20 years, I thought my dad was gone. And now, here you are, wanting to fill a role I didn't even realize was missing. Stephen's chest tightened at Austin's words, but he nodded, his tone calm. I understand, and I don't expect this to be easy for either of us. But I'm here, Austin, for as long as it takes. Rachel watched the exchange silently, her eyes glistening with emotion. She reached for Austin's hand, squeezing it gently. He's trying, Austin, and I think he deserves the chance to show you who he really is. Austin hesitated, then nodded slowly. Okay, he said quietly, but it's going to take time. Stephen's relief was palpable, though he kept his emotions in check. Thank you, he said sincerely. That's all I ask. As the evening wound down, Stephen walked them to the door, his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. Before leaving, Rachel turned to him, her voice soft. You're doing good, Stephen. Just keep showing him that he can count on you. Stephen nodded, his gratitude evident. I will. Thank you, Rachel. After they left, Stephen stood alone in the entryway, the quiet of his apartment settling around him. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope, a sense that the family he had longed for was within reach. The next few weeks were filled with small but significant moments of progress. Stephen and Austin began meeting regularly, whether for lunch, a game of basketball at the park, or simply walking through the city. Each interaction brought them closer, their conversations becoming more natural and open. But the shadow of Deborah and Adam loomed large, and Stephen couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't finished meddling. His instincts proved correct when he received a call from his lawyer, informing him that Deborah had made inquiries about Rachel and Austin's legal status in relation to the Mitchell estate. Stephen's anger flared, but he quickly calmed himself. This wasn't the time for reactionary measures. Instead, he decided to take proactive steps to protect Rachel and Austin, ensuring that neither Deborah nor Adam could interfere with their lives again. He consulted with his lawyer, outlining plans to amend his will and legally recognize Austin as his son. The move wasn't just about securing their future, it was a statement. Deborah's influence was no longer absolute. When Stephen shared the news with Rachel, she was both surprised and touched. You didn't have to do that, she said softly. I did, Stephen replied firmly. I need to protect you and Austin. It's the least I can do after everything you've been through. Rachel smiled, her eyes glistening. Thank you, Stephen, for everything. As Stephen watched Rachel and Austin begin to trust him more, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was still uncertain, but one thing was clear. He wasn't fighting this battle alone anymore. Together, they were stronger and ready to face whatever came next. Stephen Mitchell stared at his phone, the lawyer's warning echoing in his mind. Deborah's attempts to meddle with Rachel and Austin's place in his life were far from over, and the stakes had grown higher. The thought of her trying to manipulate them, even now, filled him with anger, but it also strengthened his resolve. It was time to face his mother head-on and end her influence once and for all. The next day, Stephen scheduled a meeting with Deborah at the family estate. The grand mansion loomed like a relic of another era, its towering columns and manicured lawns a stark reminder of the power and control Deborah had wielded for decades. As he stepped through the heavy oak doors, he felt the weight of the past pressing down on him. Deborah was waiting in the parlor, seated on an ornate chaise lounge with a cup of tea balanced elegantly in her hand. She looked up as Stephen entered, her expression cool and composed. "Stephen," she said. Her tone clipped. "To what do I owe this surprise?" Stephen remained standing, his posture rigid. "We need to talk, Mother." Deborah set her teacup down with a soft clink, her sharp eyes narrowing slightly. "This sounds serious." "It is," Stephen replied, his voice steady. "I know what you've been doing. The inquiries about Rachel and Austin, trying to undermine their place in my life. It stops now." Deborah's expression didn't waver. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said smoothly. "I've done no such thing." "Don't lie to me," Stephen said, his voice rising. "You've spent your entire life manipulating me, controlling me, but this time, you've gone too far. Austin is my son, and you will not interfere with his life." Deborah's lips tightened, her mask of composure slipping slightly. "Stephen, you're being dramatic. I was simply ensuring that everything is in order. You have a legacy to protect." Stephen took a step closer, his jaw clenched. "Don't you dare pretend this is about me. This has always been about you, your control, your power. But I'm done letting you dictate my life. Rachel and Austin are my family now, and nothing you do will change that." Deborah stood, her eyes flashing with anger. "Family," she scoffed. "That girl was never good enough for you, Stephen. She was a distraction, a threat to everything we've built. And as for that boy, you have no idea what kind of influence he'll have on our name." Stephen's hands balled into fists, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Our name," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You mean your name? Because that's all that's ever mattered to you, but not anymore. I'm rewriting my will, Mother. Austin will be recognized as my son and heir, and Rachel will be protected from whatever schemes you have left." Deborah's face hardened, her voice sharp. "You're making a mistake. Stephen, one you'll regret. The only mistake I've ever made was listening to you." Stephen shot back, "But not anymore." Deborah stared at him, the weight of his defiance sinking in. For the first time, she looked unsettled, her veneer of control cracking under the pressure. "You're throwing away everything I've worked for," she said coldly. "No," Stephen replied, his voice steady. "I'm building something better." After the confrontation, Stephen left the estate with a renewed sense of purpose. Deborah's words had stung, but they had also reaffirmed his commitment to Rachel and Austin. He couldn't change the past, but he could ensure that their future was free from Deborah's influence. That evening, Stephen met Rachel and Austin at their favorite cafe in the city. The cozy atmosphere, with its warm lighting and soft chatter, was a welcome contrast to the cold grandeur of the Mitchell estate. "How did it go?" Rachel asked as Stephen slid into the booth beside her. Stephen hesitated, then sighed. "About as well as I expected. She denied everything at first, but I confronted her about the inquiries. She knows I won't tolerate her interference anymore." Rachel reached for his hand, her touch grounding him. "I'm sorry you had to go through that." Stephen shook his head, a faint smile on his lips. "It was worth it. She knows now that I'm serious, that nothing she does will come between us again." Austin, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke. "So, what happens now?" Stephen turned to him, his expression earnest. "Now, we move forward, together. I've made arrangements to protect both of you legally, and I'll do whatever it takes to make sure you're both safe." Austin nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "I appreciate that, but it's going to take more than legal documents to fix everything." "I know," Stephen said, "and I'm willing to do the work." Austin's expression softened, though his tone remained cautious. "Good, because I'm not ready to call you Dad, but I'm willing to see where this goes. Stephen's chest tightened with emotion, but he managed to smile. That's more than I could ask for. As the night wore on, the three of them talked openly, their conversation flowing more naturally than it ever had before. Stephen shared stories from his past, moments of vulnerability and humor that allowed Austin to see him in a new light. Rachel, too, seemed to relax, her laughter genuine as they reminisced about old times and dreamed about the future. When the evening ended, Stephen walked them to their car, his heart lighter than it had been in years. As Rachel hugged him goodbye, she whispered, "You're doing good, Stephen. Don't stop now." "I won't," he promised, his voice firm. Austin offered a nod, his expression thoughtful but not unfriendly. "See you around," he said, climbing into the car. As Stephen watched them drive away, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he believed they were heading in the right direction. Together, the weeks following Stephen's confrontation with Deborah were a delicate balancing act. His relationship with Austin was progressing slowly but steadily, and Rachel seemed to be allowing herself to trust him again. Still, the shadow of his family's past manipulations lingered. Stephen knew that for their bond to truly solidify, the truth about Austin's paternity would need to be acknowledged publicly. No more secrets, no more hiding. The opportunity came in the form of a charity gala hosted by the Mitchell Foundation. The event was one of the most prestigious on the social calendar, attended by influential figures from business, politics, and the arts. Stephen had initially considered skipping it altogether, wary of the drama it might invite. But as the date approached, he realized it was the perfect platform to make a statement. Rachel was understandably hesitant when Stephen proposed the idea. They were seated in a quiet corner of her apartment, the warm glow of a table lamp casting soft shadows on the walls. "You want to announce it there, in front of everyone?" she asked, her tone a mixture of disbelief and concern. Stephen nodded, his expression calm but determined. "It's time, Rachel. I've spent too long letting my mother control the narrative. This is my chance to take it back, and to show the world that Austin is my son." Rachel crossed her arms, her brow furrowed. "And what about Austin? Have you talked to him about this?" "I will," Stephen promised. "But I wanted to talk to you first. I need you to trust me on this." Rachel sighed, her gaze softening. "I do trust you, Stephen. I just don't want Austin to get hurt." "He won't," Stephen assured her. "I'll make sure of it." Later that evening, Stephen met Austin at a small cafe near campus. The young man had been busy with exams, but he made time to meet, curious about Stephen's invitation. As they sat across from each other, Stephen decided to approach the subject directly. "There's something I need to talk to you about," Stephen began, his tone serious but measured. Austin raised an eyebrow. "That sounds ominous. What's going on?" Stephen hesitated, then took a deep breath. "The Mitchell Foundation is hosting a charity gala next week. It's a big event, and I think it's time we made things official. Publicly." Austin blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Publicly? What do you mean?" Stephen met his gaze, his voice steady. "I want to introduce you as my son." The weight of the words hung in the air. Austin stared at Stephen, his expression unreadable. "You want to tell a room full of strangers that I'm your son?" Austin asked slowly. "Why?" "Because it's the truth," Stephen said simply. "And because I'm tired of hiding. You deserve to be acknowledged, Austin, for who you are and what you mean to me." Austin leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. "And what if I'm not ready for that? What if I don't want to be paraded around like some accessory?" Stephen's heart sank, but he kept his tone calm. "This isn't about showing you off, Austin. It's about standing up for what's right. I want to show the world that I'm proud of you, that I'm proud to be your father." Austin was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the table. Finally, he looked up, his expression softening. "If I say yes, it's not just for you, it's for Mom. She deserves to see the truth come out, after everything she's been through." Stephen smiled, relief washing over him. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "I promise I'll handle everything. You just need to be yourself." The night of the gala arrived, and the Mitchell Foundation's event hall sparkled with opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the crowd of elegantly dressed guests, and the hum of conversation filled the air. Stephen stood near the entrance, waiting for Rachel and Austin to arrive. When they walked in, Stephen's breath caught. Rachel was stunning in a deep blue gown that complemented her graceful demeanor, and Austin looked confident in a tailored suit. Stephen greeted them with a warm smile, his heart swelling with pride. "You both look amazing," he said. Rachel smiled softly, while Austin adjusted his tie, his expression slightly nervous. "Let's just get this over with," Austin muttered, though his tone carried a hint of humor. As the evening progressed, Stephen mingled with the crowd, introducing Rachel and Austin to key figures. There were curious glances and whispers, but Stephen ignored them. He had planned a short speech for later in the evening, and he knew it would answer all the questions lingering in the room. When the time came, Stephen took the stage, the room falling silent as he stepped up to the microphone. He glanced at Rachel and Austin, who stood near the front, their expressions a mix of apprehension and encouragement. "Good evening, everyone," Stephen began, his voice steady. "Thank you for being here tonight to support the Mitchell Foundation's efforts. Your generosity helps us make a difference in countless lives, and for that, I'm deeply grateful." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "But tonight is also personal for me. For years, I've hidden parts of my life, parts of myself from the world, out of fear, out of shame, out of misplaced loyalty, but no more." The room was utterly silent, every eye on Stephen. "I want to introduce you all to someone very special," he said, gesturing toward Austin. "This is my son, Austin Mitchell." Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by murmurs of surprise. Stephen ignored them, his focus solely on Austin, who stood tall despite the scrutiny. "I lost 20 years with him," Stephen continued, his voice tinged with emotion. 20 years I can never get back. But tonight I'm reclaiming what was stolen from me, Austin. I'm proud of you, and I'm honored to call you my son." The room erupted in applause, but Stephen barely noticed. His gaze was locked on Austin, whose expression softened into a faint smile. Rachel wiped away a tear, her pride and relief evident. In that moment, Stephen knew he had made the right decision. The truth was finally out, and the bonds he had fought so hard to rebuild were stronger than ever. The days following the gala were a whirlwind. Stephen Mitchell's public acknowledgement of Austin as his son had sent shockwaves through the social circles of New York. Newspapers ran headlines about the revelation, accompanied by photos of Stephen standing proudly beside Austin and Rachel. Most reactions were positive, celebrating Stephen's decision to embrace his family. But one person was conspicuously silent, Deborah Mitchell. Stephen knew it wouldn't last. It didn't take long for her to strike. Less than a week after the gala, Stephen received a summons to meet Deborah at the Mitchell estate. The tone of the message was formal, even hostile, and Stephen suspected she wasn't inviting him for a casual conversation. Nevertheless, he agreed to the meeting. It was time to end her interference once and for all. Stephen arrived at the estate mid-morning, the atmosphere heavy with tension. Deborah was waiting for him in the library, her posture as rigid as the high-backed chair she sat in. She didn't rise to greet him, her piercing gaze fixed on him as he entered. "You've made quite the spectacle," Deborah said coldly, her voice dripping with disdain, parading that woman and her son in front of the world as if they belong in our family. "They do belong," Stephen replied firmly, his tone unwavering. "Whether you like it or not, Austin is my son, and Rachel, she's the woman I should have stood by all those years ago." Deborah's lips tightened, her composure cracking slightly. "You've made a fool of yourself, Stephen. Do you realize what this could do to our reputation, to the Mitchell name?" Stephen leaned forward, his voice calm but laced with steel. "I don't care about the Mitchell name, Mother, not anymore. The only reputation I care about is the one I have with my son, and with Rachel." Deborah's expression darkened, her voice rising. "You're throwing away everything your father and I built. That boy will ruin you. Mark my words." "No," Stephen said, his voice sharp. "You ruined me. You stole 20 years of my life, 20 years with my family, because you couldn't stand the idea of me being happy." Deborah rose from her chair, her fury finally breaking through. "I did what was best for you." Stephen's voice remained steady, though his anger burned beneath the surface. "You did what was best for you, but it's over, Mother. I've already taken steps to ensure you can't interfere anymore." Deborah froze, her eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about?" Stephen reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder, placing it on the table between them. "This," he said. "My lawyer has filed to officially recognize Austin as my son and heir. Rachel and Austin are protected under the law, and any further attempts by you or Adam to undermine them will have legal consequences." Deborah's face turned pale, her carefully constructed world crumbling before her eyes. "You can't do this," she hissed. "I already have," Stephen replied, "and there's nothing you can do to stop it." For the first time in his life, Stephen watched his mother falter. The icy composure that had defined her for decades was gone, replaced by a flicker of vulnerability. But Stephen felt no satisfaction in her defeat, only relief that her influence over his life was finally at an end. As he turned to leave, Deborah called after him, her voice trembling. "Stephen, wait." He paused, glancing back over his shoulder. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her tone softer now. "After everything I've done for you." Stephen met her gaze, his expression weary but resolute. "Because you've done enough damage, Mother, and I won't let you hurt my family anymore." When Stephen returned to Manhattan that evening, he felt a sense of closure he hadn't known he needed. The confrontation with Deborah had been painful, but it had also been liberating. For the first time, he felt truly free. Rachel and Austin were waiting for him at a small Italian restaurant they'd chosen for dinner. The warm, bustling atmosphere was a welcome contrast to the cold, oppressive air of the Mitchell estate. "How did it go?" Rachel asked as Stephen sat down. Stephen gave her a reassuring smile. "It's done. She knows she can't touch us anymore." Austin studied him carefully, his expression thoughtful. "And Adam. Adam won't be a problem," Stephen said firmly. "I made it clear that any interference would have consequences." Austin nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the table. "Thanks," he said quietly. Stephen reached across the table, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "You don't need to thank me. It's my job to protect you, and I'll never stop." The rest of the evening passed in laughter and shared stories, the weight of the past beginning to lift. For the first time, Stephen felt a true sense of belonging, surrounded by the family he had fought so hard to reclaim. As they walked out into the cool night air, Rachel slipped her arm through Stephen's. "You've come a long way," she said softly. "I'm proud of you." Stephen smiled, his heart full. "I couldn't have done it without you." Austin, walking a few steps ahead, glanced back with a small smile. "Are you two always going to be this mushy?" he teased. Rachel laughed, nudging Stephen playfully. "Get used to it." Stephen chuckled, feeling a warmth he hadn't experienced in years, for the first time in decades. His future felt bright. The weeks following Stephen's final confrontation with Deborah marked a turning point in his life. The weight of her manipulations was gone, leaving room for something new, healing. He had spent years trapped in a cycle of regret and loneliness, but now, with Rachel and Austin by his side, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known was missing. Stephen was determined to prove that he was serious about being the father Austin deserved. He started small, focusing on quality time together, simple moments that built trust without overwhelming his son. Whether it was cheering Austin on at one of his intramural basketball games or joining him for coffee near campus, Stephen made it clear that he was committed. One evening, as they walked through Central Park after grabbing dinner, Austin broke the comfortable silence. "You know," he began, his tone thoughtful, "I never really thought about having a dad. Mom always. She made up for it." Stephen nodded, his hands in his pockets. "She did an incredible job. I don't think I'll ever be able to thank her enough for everything she's done for you." Austin glanced at him, his expression softening. "She's always said that you were a good guy, that things just didn't work out." Stephen swallowed hard, the guilt resurfacing. "Things didn't work out because I wasn't strong enough to fight for her. Or for you. That's on me, Austin. But I want you to know that I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you, if you'll let me." Austin stopped walking, turning to face him. "I don't need you to make it up to me," he said, his voice steady. I just need you to show up, to be here." Stephen felt a lump rise in his throat, but he managed a nod. "I can do that," he said quietly. "I promise." Austin smiled faintly, and for the first time Stephen saw a glimpse of something more than tentative trust. He saw hope. Meanwhile, Stephen's relationship with Rachel was evolving in ways he hadn't expected. After years of estrangement, they were rediscovering the connection that had once bound them so deeply. Their conversations were no longer burdened by the past, but filled with laughter, shared memories, and dreams for the future. One evening, Stephen invited Rachel to dinner at a small, candlelit bistro in the West Village. The setting was intimate, the kind of place that encouraged lingering over dessert and meaningful conversations. "You've been quiet," Rachel said, studying him over her glass of wine. "What's on your mind?" Stephen hesitated, then set his fork down, meeting her gaze. "I've been thinking about us," he admitted, "about everything we've been through, and how much I want to make things right, not just for Austin, but for you too." Rachel tilted her head, a soft smile playing on her lips. "You're already doing that, Stephen. You've changed. I can see it. I don't just want to change," he said, his voice low but earnest. "I want to build something with you again, if you'll let me." Rachel looked down, her expression thoughtful. When she raised her eyes to meet his, they were filled with both warmth and caution. "Stephen, I've spent a long time learning how to stand on my own, letting someone back into my life. It's not easy." "I know," Stephen said, "and I don't expect it to happen overnight, but I'm here, Rachel, for the long haul." Rachel smiled, reaching across the table to take his hand. "Then let's take it one step at a time," as the weeks turned into months. The three of them, Stephen, Rachel, and Austin, found their rhythm as a family. It wasn't perfect, and there were moments of tension and misunderstanding, but the progress they made was undeniable. One sunny afternoon, they decided to visit a park on the outskirts of the city. Austin had brought a frisbee, and what began as a casual outing quickly turned into a lively game that drew laughter and playful banter. For Stephen, it was a glimpse of what he had missed, and a reminder of what he was fighting to build. At one point, as Stephen and Austin sat on a bench catching their breath, Rachel joined them with bottles of water. She handed one to Stephen, her smile warm. "You're not bad for an old man," Austin teased, taking a swig of his water. Stephen chuckled, shaking his head. "I'll take that as a compliment." Rachel laughed, her gaze flickering between the two of them. "You two are more alike than you realize," Austin grinned, leaning back against the bench. "Don't push it, Mom." Later that evening, as they walked back to their car, Austin turned to Stephen with a hesitant expression. "You know, I think Mom's right," he said. Stephen raised an eyebrow. "About what?" "That we're alike," Austin admitted, his tone almost shy. "I didn't want to see it at first, but I do now." Stephen felt a swell of emotion, but he kept his tone light. "I'll take that as a compliment too." Austin smirked, but there was warmth in his eyes. "Don't let it go to your head." As they reached the car, Rachel leaned into Stephen, her voice low. "You're doing it, Stephen. You're winning him over." Stephen smiled, his heart full. "I couldn't have done it without you." Rachel squeezed his hand before climbing into the car. As Stephen slid into the driver's seat, he glanced at his family in the rearview mirror, a sense of contentment washing over him. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like they were heading in the right direction. Together, the crisp autumn air carried the faint scent of fallen leaves, as Stephen Mitchell stood on the balcony of his apartment, gazing at the city below. The skyline was bathed in a warm, golden glow, and for the first time in years, Stephen felt at peace. The path to this moment hadn't been easy, but the effort had been worth it. Rachel and Austin were no longer distant figures from his past. They were his family that morning. They had all gathered at a local community center for a charity event Rachel had organized. It was an initiative close to her heart, providing scholarships for underprivileged students. Stephen had been eager to support her efforts, both financially and by rolling up his sleeves to help. Watching Rachel in her element, passionate and driven, had only deepened his admiration for her. "You've got a good one," Austin had teased during the event, nudging Stephen as they watched Rachel speak to a group of volunteers. Stephen had smiled, his gaze never leaving her. "I know." That evening, Stephen invited Rachel and Austin to his apartment for dinner. It had become a weekly tradition, a chance to share a meal, swap stories, and grow closer as a family. Stephen had taken up cooking as a way to contribute, and while his culinary skills were still developing, Rachel and Austin were kind enough not to tease him too much. "Smells good in here," Rachel said as she walked into the kitchen, her voice warm and teasing. "What's on the menu tonight, Chef Mitchell?" "Spaghetti carbonara," Stephen replied with a grin, wiping his hands on a towel. "And before you ask, yes, I followed the recipe this time." Austin chuckled as he set the table. "About time. That creative take on stir-fry last week was interesting," Stephen laughed, shaking his head. "Hey, I'm learning. Give me some credit." As they sat down to eat, the conversation flowed easily. They talked about Austin's classes, Rachel's work, and Stephen's plans to expand the Mitchell Foundation's initiatives. The warmth and laughter around the table felt natural, unforced, a far cry from the tension and uncertainty of their earlier encounters. After dinner, they moved to the living room, where Stephen surprised them with an announcement. "I've been thinking about something," he began, his tone thoughtful, "about how much my priorities have changed over the past few months." Rachel and Austin exchanged curious glances but remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "I've decided to step down as CEO of Mitchell Hotels," Stephen said, his voice steady. "I want to focus more on the foundation and on spending time with you both." Rachel's eyes widened, her expression a mix of surprise and admiration. "Stephen, are you sure? That's a huge decision." "I'm sure," Stephen replied. "I've spent most of my life chasing success, trying to live up to expectations that weren't even mine. But none of that matters anymore. What matters is this: us." Austin leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "What about the company? Won't stepping down cause problems?" Stephen smiled, his voice calm. "I've been preparing for this. My QO is ready to take over, and I'll still be involved as a board member. But I need to make room for what's truly important." Rachel reached for his hand, her touch gentle. "I'm proud of you, Stephen. That's not an easy choice to make." Austin nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Yeah, I guess that's pretty cool of you," Stephen chuckled, feeling a swell of emotion. "Thanks, Austin. That means a lot." As the evening wore on, they settled into a comfortable rhythm, Rachel and Stephen sipping coffee on the balcony, while Austin scrolled through his phone on the couch. The city lights twinkled like stars, and the hum of traffic below was a soothing backdrop to their quiet conversation. "You've changed so much," Rachel said softly, her gaze fixed on the skyline. "The Stephen I knew back then. He wasn't ready for this, but you are now." Stephen turned to her, his expression earnest. "I had to lose everything to realize what really mattered, and I'm not letting go again." Rachel smiled, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I believe you." Inside, Austin glanced at them through the glass door, a faint smile on his face. He didn't say it out loud, but he was beginning to believe it too. A few weeks later, the three of them took a trip upstate to visit the countryside. Rachel had suggested it as a way to unwind and spend time together away from the bustle of the city. They rented a small cabin surrounded by vibrant autumn foliage, and the weekend was filled with hiking, campfires, and late-night conversations under the stars one evening as they sat around the fire. Austin surprised them both by pulling out a small photo album. "I found this while cleaning out some old boxes," he explained, handing it to Rachel. "Thought you might want to see it." Rachel opened the album, her breath catching as she recognized photos from Austin's childhood, birthday parties, school events, and candid moments she had captured over the years. Stephen leaned closer, his heart aching with both regret and gratitude as he saw the life he had missed. "You've built something amazing, Rachel," Stephen said quietly, "and I'm so grateful that you let me be a part of it now." Rachel looked at him, her eyes filled with emotion. "We're building it together now. That's what matters." Austin, who had been watching them with a hint of amusement, smirked. "Okay, you two are getting sappy again." They laughed, the sound echoing in the crisp night air. For the first time in decades, Stephen felt whole. The journey hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead, but they were facing them together, as a family. As the fire crackled and the stars shone brightly above, Stephen leaned back in his chair, a contented smile on his face. This was his new beginning, a life built on love, trust, and second chances. And for the first time in years, he truly believed that the best was yet to come.